For decades, the name Sellafield has stood as one of the most recognizable and controversial sites in Britain's nuclear history. Stretching across the Cumbrian coastline, it represents scientific ambition, national security, and the immense responsibility that comes with harnessing atomic power. Yet beneath the modern facility lies the story of an event that changed nuclear safety forever. Long before Sellafield became synonymous with fuel reprocessing and radioactive waste management, it was known by another name, Windscale. In October 1957, a fire deep inside one of Windscale's nuclear reactors released radioactive material into the atmosphere. It became the worst nuclear accident in British history and the first major reactor fire the world had ever witnessed. Unlike explosions that unfold in seconds, this disaster developed slowly. Operators believed they were carrying out a routine procedure. Instruments appeared to show one thing while conditions inside the reactor told a very different story. By the time the true danger became clear, the graphite core was already burning. The decisions made over the following hours would determine whether the disaster remained a national emergency or became something far worse. Much of what happened remained hidden from the public for years. Official reports were restricted, political pressures shaped what information was released, and many of the long-term consequences only became clear decades later. Today, the Windscale fire is recognized as a defining moment in the history of nuclear engineering. It transformed reactor design, emergency planning, radiation monitoring, and the regulation of civilian nuclear power across the world. This is the story of how Britain's drive to become a nuclear superpower led to an accident that changed the industry forever. Today, the original Windscale reactors stand silent within the vast Sellafield nuclear complex. Around them, generations of newer facilities have appeared as the site evolved from weapons production to fuel reprocessing, decommissioning, and long-term radioactive waste management. The towering chimneys and heavily shielded buildings are reminders that the legacy of Windscale never truly disappeared. Every major project on the site has been shaped by lessons learned from the fire of 1957. Before examining how that disaster unfolded, we must return to the years immediately after the Second World War, when Britain entered a race unlike any it had faced before, a race to master the atom. The origins of the Windscale fire lie not in a power station, but in the tense years that followed the Second World War. In 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated a new and devastating form of warfare. Within months, the world's leading powers had entered an arms race defined by nuclear technology. Britain was determined not to be left behind. Although it had worked closely with the United States during the wartime Manhattan Project, post-war cooperation quickly diminished. The passing of the American McMahon Act in 1946 restricted the sharing of nuclear secrets, leaving Britain to develop its own independent program. For the British government, possessing an atomic weapon was about more than military strength. It was seen as essential for maintaining influence on the world stage and preserving the nation's status as a major power during the emerging Cold War. To achieve that goal, Britain needed one crucial material: plutonium. Producing it required dedicated nuclear reactors capable of irradiating uranium fuel before the newly created plutonium could be chemically separated. Construction began on a remote stretch of the Cumbrian coast, chosen for its reliable water supply, rail connections, and distance from major population centers. The site became known as Windscale. Two large air-cooled graphite reactors, known simply as Pile 1 and Pile 2, were designed specifically to manufacture plutonium for Britain's growing nuclear weapons program. Electricity generation was never their primary purpose. Every aspect of their design reflected the urgency of producing fissile material as quickly as possible. The project advanced at remarkable speed. Engineers and construction workers built the reactors under intense political pressure, while scientists continued learning about reactor behavior in real time. Many aspects of graphite physics, radiation damage, and long-term reactor operation were still poorly understood because no country had decades of practical experience. By the early 1950s, Windscale had become one of the most important facilities in Britain's secret nuclear program. Day and night, uranium fuel was loaded, irradiated, and removed to support the production of plutonium. The reactors fulfilled their military mission, but hidden inside the graphite moderator, an invisible problem was steadily developing. Every day the reactors operated, energy became trapped within the graphite itself. At first, the effect appeared manageable. Over time, however, it would become one of the greatest hazards ever faced by the operators of Windscale. That hidden danger would eventually set the stage for the events of October 1957. The Windscale reactors were unlike the pressurized water reactors that would later become common around the world. They reflected the technology and priorities of the late 1940s, when the primary objective was producing plutonium as rapidly as possible. Each reactor, known as a pile, consisted of a massive block of graphite pierced by thousands of horizontal channels. Uranium fuel cartridges were pushed into these channels from the front of the reactor and discharged from the rear after irradiation. As neutrons released during nuclear fission collided with the graphite, the reaction could be sustained, while new plutonium slowly formed inside the uranium fuel. Unlike modern reactors, the Windscale piles relied on air for cooling. Enormous fans continuously drew outside air through the graphite core before releasing it through towering chimneys. Engineers recognized that radioactive particles could potentially escape in an accident, so the chief engineer, Sir John Cockcroft, insisted on installing high-efficiency filters at the top of the chimneys. Some critics dismissed them as an unnecessary expense, referring to them as Cockcroft's folly. Years later, those filters would prove invaluable by trapping a significant proportion of radioactive material during the fire. Operating the reactors demanded constant attention. Fuel temperatures, airflow, and neutron activity were monitored around the clock, while operators routinely loaded fresh uranium and removed irradiated fuel. The system appeared reliable, and the reactors successfully supplied plutonium for Britain's first generation of nuclear weapons. Yet every period of operation altered the graphite moderator itself. Fast-moving neutrons displaced carbon atoms from their normal positions within the crystal structure, storing energy inside the graphite. This phenomenon, later known as Wigner energy, accumulated gradually with each operating cycle. Scientists understood that the stored energy could be released by carefully heating the graphite in a controlled process known as an annealing cycle. If performed correctly, the graphite returned to a more stable condition without damaging the reactor. However, predicting exactly how much energy had accumulated deep within the enormous graphite core was far from straightforward. Temperature measurements were limited, the behavior of the graphite was not fully understood, and significant portions of the reactor could not be directly observed. As the years passed and production demands increased, these uncertainties became increasingly significant. What had begun as a manageable engineering challenge slowly evolved into a risk hidden deep inside the reactor itself, a risk that would soon be underestimated with catastrophic consequences. By the mid-1950s, the Windscale reactors had completed years of continuous operation. To those working on site, they appeared to be performing as intended. Yet inside the graphite core, invisible changes were accumulating with every passing day. As energetic neutrons struck the graphite moderator, they displaced carbon atoms from their normal positions within the crystal lattice. The damage was microscopic, but it trapped energy throughout the reactor. This stored energy, known as Wigner energy after physicist Eugene Wigner, could not remain locked away indefinitely. Engineers had developed a solution known as annealing. By deliberately raising the temperature of the graphite, the displaced atoms could return to their normal positions, releasing the stored energy in a controlled manner. Previous annealing operations had been completed successfully, giving operators confidence that the process was understood. In reality, the behavior of the graphite was far more complex than anyone realized. Temperature sensors monitored only selected areas of the reactor, leaving large regions effectively invisible. Heat could build unevenly within the massive graphite block, while localized hot spots remained undetected. Production demands also placed pressure on operations. The reactors were expected to maximize plutonium output, and changes to fuel loading patterns altered how heat was distributed throughout the core. These factors made each annealing cycle increasingly difficult to predict. During early October 1957, operators began another routine Wigner energy release on Pile 1. Initial heating appeared less effective than expected. Some instruments suggested that not enough energy had been released, leading engineers to conclude that a second heating cycle was necessary. Unknown to those in the control room, parts of the graphite had already become much hotter than the available instruments indicated. While some regions remained relatively cool, others were approaching temperatures capable of damaging fuel cartridges hidden deep within the reactor. The conflicting readings created a false picture of the reactor's condition. Believing the annealing process was incomplete, operators authorized additional heating. That decision, made with the information available at the time, unknowingly pushed sections of the reactor beyond safe operating conditions. Within hours, damaged uranium fuel would ignite, and Britain would face the first major nuclear reactor fire in history. On the 7th of October, 1957, operators at Windscale Pile 1 began what was intended to be a routine annealing cycle. Airflow was adjusted, and the reactor was gradually heated to release the accumulated Wigner energy trapped within the graphite. At first, the results appeared disappointing. Temperature readings suggested that much of the stored energy remained locked inside the reactor. Engineers reviewed the available data and concluded that the graphite had not responded as expected. Believing the release had been incomplete, they authorized additional heating. The instruments available to the control room could not reveal the full picture. Only selected parts of the reactor were monitored, leaving large areas hidden from direct observation. Unknown to the operators, some sections of the graphite had already reached far higher temperatures than the gauges indicated. As the second heating cycle progressed, uranium fuel cartridges deep within the pile began to overheat. Several became damaged, allowing uranium metal to react with the surrounding air. Temperatures continued to climb inside isolated channels where no direct measurements existed. When operators attempted to discharge fuel for inspection, they encountered alarming evidence. Some cartridges were unusually hot, while others showed signs of severe damage. Radiation levels around the discharge equipment increased, confirming that something inside the reactor was seriously wrong. The control room still lacked a complete understanding of the situation. Was the reactor simply hotter than expected, or had a more dangerous event already begun? Further inspections provided the answer. Looking into one of the fuel channels, workers saw an unmistakable orange glow from deep within the graphite core. The reactor was on fire. The discovery transformed what had been considered a difficult maintenance operation into a national emergency. A graphite-moderated, air-cooled reactor was burning from the inside, fueled by the very airflow designed to keep it operating. No nation had previously confronted a reactor fire of this kind. Procedures were limited, experience was almost non-existent, and every decision carried enormous uncertainty. The race to extinguish the fire had begun. Once the fire had been confirmed, the immediate priority was to understand its scale. Operators increased radiation monitoring, inspected accessible fuel channels, and searched for any indication of how far the flames had spread. The evidence pointed to a fire burning deep within the graphite core, beyond direct reach. The first response was to increase the airflow through the reactor. Under normal circumstances, greater airflow would remove heat from the fuel. Instead, it supplied the fire with additional oxygen, allowing burning uranium and surrounding graphite to burn even more intensely. Temperatures continued to rise. Engineers next attempted to remove fuel from channels close to the fire, hoping to create a barrier that would slow its spread. The operation was dangerous. Many fuel cartridges had swollen or become distorted by the heat, making extraction difficult. Workers were exposed to elevated radiation levels while carrying out the task, and every movement had to be performed with great care. Despite these efforts, the fire persisted. As conditions deteriorated, the management team faced an increasingly difficult decision. One proposal was to flood the reactor with water. Although water could cool the fire, it also presented serious risks. At very high temperatures, water reacting with hot uranium could produce hydrogen gas. If enough hydrogen accumulated and ignited, the consequences might be even more severe. For hours, the decision was debated, while temperatures remained dangerously high. Eventually, with other options failing, the order was given. Water was pumped into the reactor in carefully controlled stages, while operators closely monitored the response. It was a calculated gamble. Gradually, the temperatures began to fall. The glowing fuel channels dimmed, radiation readings stabilized, and signs of active combustion decreased. After days of uncertainty, the reactor fire was finally brought under control. Although the flames had been extinguished, the emergency was far from over. Radioactive gases and particles had already escaped through the reactor's ventilation system. While Cockcroft's filters captured a significant proportion of the contamination, they could not stop everything. Invisible radioactive material had been carried by the wind across parts of northern England. The battle inside the reactor had ended. The challenge of protecting the public was only beginning. Although the reactor fire had been extinguished, radioactive contamination had already escaped into the atmosphere. The plume contained a mixture of radioactive isotopes, including iodine-131, cesium-137, and polonium-210. Carried by changing winds, the contamination spread across parts of Cumbria and beyond. Fortunately, one of the reactor's most criticized safety features proved its worth. The filters installed at the top of the Windscale chimney trapped a substantial proportion of radioactive particles before they could leave the site. Without them, the environmental release would almost certainly have been far greater. Monitoring teams were rapidly deployed to measure radiation levels in the surrounding countryside. Air, soil, vegetation, and livestock were sampled as scientists worked to understand the scale of the release. One result became immediately concerning. Radioactive iodine had settled onto grazing land, where dairy cattle consumed contaminated grass. The isotope quickly entered the milk supply, creating a direct pathway for radiation exposure, particularly among children. The government responded by imposing an emergency ban on the sale and distribution of milk from affected farms. Millions of liters were collected and safely disposed of rather than entering the food chain. The restrictions remained in place until repeated testing confirmed that contamination levels had fallen below the safety limits of the time. Despite these measures, relatively little information was released to the public during the emergency. Britain was still deeply engaged in the Cold War, and the country's nuclear weapons program remained highly secret. Officials sought to balance public safety with national security, resulting in limited public disclosure during and immediately after the incident. In the years that followed, scientists continued to study the health consequences of the accident. Later analyses concluded that the protective actions, particularly the rapid withdrawal of contaminated milk, significantly reduced public radiation exposure. While estimates differ, research has suggested that a small number of cancer cases may have been linked to the release, though the overall health impact was far lower than might have occurred without intervention. The Windscale fire exposed weaknesses not only in reactor design, but also in emergency planning, environmental monitoring, and public communication. Its lessons would influence nuclear safety policies around the world for decades to come. As investigations continued, the accident became recognized as a turning point in the history of Britain's nuclear program. The reactor would never operate again, and the country's approach to reactor safety underwent fundamental change. The Windscale fire marked the end of an era. Although the immediate crisis had passed, its consequences would influence British nuclear policy for generations. Pile 1 was permanently shut down, while confidence in the original reactor design was fundamentally shaken. Investigations concluded that the accident had resulted from a combination of limited scientific understanding, inadequate instrumentation, and operational decisions made with incomplete information. The reactor behaved in ways that its designers had never fully anticipated. In the years that followed, nuclear engineering advanced rapidly. Reactor designs incorporated improved cooling systems, more comprehensive temperature monitoring, enhanced containment measures, and increasingly rigorous safety procedures. Independent regulation also became far more prominent, with greater emphasis placed on learning from incidents rather than concealing them. The Windscale site itself continued to evolve. As Britain's civilian nuclear industry expanded, the facility became known as Sellafield and took on new responsibilities, including fuel reprocessing, waste management, decommissioning, and environmental restoration. Today, much of the work carried out there focuses not on producing nuclear materials, but on safely managing the legacy of earlier generations. The original Windscale reactors remain among the most challenging nuclear structures ever built in Britain. Decommissioning them is expected to take many decades, reflecting both the complexity of the site and the long-lived nature of radioactive contamination. Looking back with modern knowledge, it is easy to identify mistakes. Yet the engineers and operators of the 1950s were working at the frontier of a technology that was still in its infancy. Many of the principles that guide nuclear safety today were written only after accidents such as Windscale revealed what had previously been unknown. The Windscale fire did not become the world's largest nuclear disaster, but it became one of its most important. It demonstrated that even routine operations could produce unforeseen consequences, that safety systems dismissed as unnecessary could ultimately save lives, And that transparency is as vital to nuclear safety as engineering itself. More than half a century later, the lessons of October 1957 continue to shape reactor design, emergency planning, and international nuclear regulation. The fire at Windscale stands not only as a warning from history, but as a reminder that progress in science is measured not simply by success, but by the willingness to learn from failure.